Well, Bill, there are more mentions of you and the work of reasonable faith on YouTube than we can ever get to. But let's look at a few examples today and get your response. I think we ought to do this from time to time. Just pick out a
Okay.
few, see what people are saying on YouTube. But first, this just in, a new argument against atheism. And Bill, I think you have the argument there if you'll do the honors.
Yes, my colleague J.P. Moreland sent me this,
Uh
and
oh.
here's the article. A shocking report has revealed that there are still people clinging to atheism in spite of the well documented evidence of breakfast burritos. Quote, how could a rational being possibly deny the existence of a loving God after taking a bite of an egg and chorizo burrito? Questioned famed Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga as he poured on the salsa. The evidence is simply overwhelming. The article goes on to say, while theologians and philosophers have long sought to logically prove God's existence, the advent of the breakfast burrito has now rendered all previous argumentation moot. Quote, I wasted decades defending the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas to prove God's existence, when all along the answer was wrapped up in a warm tortilla, said Plantinga. The ontological argument simply cannot hold a candle to the holding the essence of goodness in your hands, all wrapped in foil. So that is the new argument now for theism, Kevin.
I think the Babylon Bee has been watching our podcast. And
That was
so
from the Babylon Bee. You're right.
that's pretty good, actually. And I suspect that this article will be discussed at this month's ETS conference. Bill, you might want to give us some details on that.
Yes, it will be interesting to see if anyone brings it up. We're meeting this year in Denver. The first pair of conferences will be the joint conventions of the Evangelical Theological and Evangelical Philosophical Societies. And I'll be presenting a paper at the EPS conference on Is God's Moral Perfection Reducible to His Love? And I'll be examining what has been called the identity thesis, defended by some Christian philosophers, that God's moral perfection is identical to God's love. During the EPS, we'll also have our annual Reasonable Faith local chapter directors meeting. Local Reasonable Faith chapter directors from all around the country and even from around the world will be joining us at the EPS, and we'll be getting together for mutual encouragement and update. And I'm really looking forward to that dinner that evening. Then at the ETS, I'll be participating in a panel discussion on Andrew Loke's new book on evolution and the origin of humanity. This is the third book of significance, I think, on the question of the historical Adam and Eve to appear in recent years. The first being Josh Swamidas's, and then my In Quest of the Historical Adam, and now Andrew Loke's book on evolution and human origins. So I'll be participating in a panel discussion talking about Andrew's proposal. His proposal involves a defense of the so-called recent genealogical Adam and Eve, according to which there were anatomically modern people outside the garden with whom Adam and Eve's descendants interbred when they were expelled from the garden. And this is a view that I am not at all sympathetic with, and so we'll be offering some criticisms of. And then following the ETS EPS conference, we'll be having our annual EPS Apologetics conference in a local church in the Denver area. And I will be presenting on arguments for the existence of God using some of our wonderful Zangmeister animated videos to communicate these arguments to a lay audience. Finally, at the next set of conferences, the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature, I'll be participating in a panel discussion Saturday night with Andrew Loke and Josh Swamidas on our 3 books, which will be discussed one after another, respectively, and then the question thrown open to the audience for their discussion. So it's going to be a very full week indeed, and I'm looking forward to it. It's always a great time of networking, fellowship, and intellectual exchange.
A busy November for you, Bill.
Yes.
Let's get to the first YouTube clip. This is atheist journalist Adam Davidson, and he writes for New Yorker magazine. I believe he's had articles in Atlantic, other prominent periodicals, and he interviewed Sean McDowell. You come up in this particular clip, so let's go to this first clip and get your comments.
It seems to me, with you in particular, like what some of the historical claims you make, when you're making them in a sort of academic context, were there a large number of people who were martyred because they witnessed a risen Jesus? That's a big question. Bart Ehrman and others will have very, I think, compelling arguments that, yes, the Bible refers to 500 people, but that's not 500. We don't have 500 different people, submitting with their names and everything. Like, to me, the actual historical case, if I've had no emotional experience or Holy Spirit experience, to me, it feels tentative. And it feels like when you talk carefully in an academic context, one could imagine a non-hidden God where there would be way less room for uncertainty, room for disagreement, even among believers. And certainly between believers and unbelievers. So I'm curious about that, because it seems important to you, at least in my eyes, that you have a historically grounded faith. You could imagine someone who says, look, I just know it. William Lane Craig has said, if it's 1 in a million, I'm going for it. Essentially a Pascal's wager. Like, I'm not going to test this the way I would test any other logical question. Because I know in my heart, because I've had that experience. But it seems to me you really want to be able to ground it in history. And I'm just wondering why that's important to you, how strong the case is, and if you really are open to a historical case that showed, the evidence is just not that robust.
So part of Craig's approach is, with apologetics, he'll say, here's how we know Christianity is true, and then how we show that it's true. So he would appeal to a direct experience he had of the risen Lord, that he knows it directly, but then apologetics is showing it to others. That's kind of a distinction that he would make.
Bill, Sean goes ahead and gives him a really good answer because he asked him a question. So I just encourage people to go to Sean's podcast and see his answer. But we wanted to deal with the fact that you were mentioned, the 500 eyewitnesses came up. He kind of touched on hiddenness of God and your epistemology.
Yes, exactly. And as Davis was speaking, thoughts were just whirling through my mind about, well, there's so many points here. What would be the best way to respond? And I thought Sean McDowell's response was brilliant because he cut right to the chase and made it so simple, this distinction between knowing and showing. That is to say, you can know that Christianity is true through the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit, or as Sean puts it, a personal relationship with the risen Lord himself. But then when you're talking to an unbeliever, and the task is to show him that Christianity is true, then you will appeal to those historical evidences that are so important. And it rather tickled me that in the past, I have been associated with evidentialism and making a case for the resurrection of Christ. But now it seems I'm starting to be associated more with this view of Reformed epistemology, that belief in God and the great things of the gospel can be properly basic. And both of them are true. We shouldn't play them off against each other. As Sean said, one is a matter of knowing, the other of showing. Now, when it comes to showing our faith to be true, I think the case for the resurrection of Jesus historically is not at all thin, as Davis seems to suggest. On the contrary, the central facts undergirding the inference to the resurrection of Jesus, namely things like Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion, his burial in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the discovery of his empty tomb by a group of his female followers, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus to various individuals and groups, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection, despite every predisposition to the contrary. Those facts represent the wide consensus of New Testament historians with regard to the fate of Jesus of Nazareth. So if there's a shortcoming in the case for the resurrection, it doesn't lie with the historical facts. Those are widely agreed upon. Rather, the question will be what best explains those facts. And here again, despite all the naturalistic hypotheses that have been offered down through history, there is no other single naturalistic hypothesis to the resurrection of Jesus that has garnered considerable scholarly support. The fact is that scholars who accept those facts but do not believe in the resurrection of Jesus typically respond with agnosticism. They say something transformative and incredible happened on that Easter morning, but we just don't know what it is, and so they prefer to remain agnostic. And that is not a shortcoming in the historical facts. That's a question philosophically for things like your openness to a supernatural worldview, the existence of God, the possibility of miracles. And I think it's that naturalistic bias that prevents people from making that inference to the resurrection of Jesus. It's not that the evidence is thin.
Next up, let's go back to the dialogue between Michael Shermer and Stephen Meyer that we featured in a podcast a few weeks ago. And we have some more from this dialogue. Bill, they mention you again. And we shortened these as much as we could, but we have several clips to look at here. Let's go to the next clip on confirmation bias.
So if the accumulated evidence you present in your book along these three major lines of inquiry were true, or that, it's substantial evidence, wouldn't most scientists who work in these areas read your book and go, yes, I think that's probably correct? And I don't see that happening. I mean, your book just came out, so maybe that's not fair for your book, but the arguments that you guys have been making since the 90s have been around. So just take Brian Keating's podcast. He read your book. He knows all the cosmology that you present in there. He understands it. And so when I had him on my podcast, I asked him, so did you convert? Are you a theist now? And to be fair, Brian's he's not an atheist like in the Dawkins mode. He's not militant about it at all. He's not something he's trying to do. So, here's what he said. As I read this as a cosmologist, and I find oftentimes, like with William Lane Craig in particular, that it's sort of this, it borders on the confirmation bias. It borders on manipulation of evidence to support a conclusion, and that conclusion always ignores the existence of alternative cosmologies, of which there are many.
Bill?
The accusation of confirmation bias is simply a highfalutin way of saying that you're prejudiced, you're biased, and therefore you're not being objective in assessing the evidence. And that, as Steve Meyer will point out, that accusation cuts both ways. A person can be biased in favor of his atheistic perspective so that he's not open to the evidence. Now, if we ask the question, well, why aren't these unbelieving scientists persuaded? I think there's two ways of answering that question. One would be the straightforward face value explanation, and that would be, well, what are the reasons that they give? They tell us why they don't accept the argument. And so those who don't embrace the Kalam cosmological argument will either reject the premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause, or that the universe began to exist. Now, since this is a probabilistic argument, there's always room to deny the premises if you want to. You can always appeal to the unknown and therefore escape the force of the argument. Now, in the case of the second premise, that the universe began to exist, what reason does Brian give for not accepting my argument for that premise? Well, he says, Craig hasn't considered alternative cosmologies. Well, that's just patently false. Anybody who's read my work knows that right from the beginning, there are lengthy discussions of alternative cosmogonic models, especially those attempting to restore a beginningless past. These are discussed in great detail in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology article that I co-authored with James Sinclair. So here, Brian is simply inaccurate. We have examined these models in great detail, and there is no empirically tenable, mathematically consistent model of a universe with an infinite past. And you needn't believe me. Ask Alexander Vilenkin, one of the most prominent of contemporary cosmologists. Even if I could be guilty of the oversight of not looking at other cosmologies, certainly Vilenkin is not guilty of that oversight. And he argues extensively that, in fact, it is probable that the universe did have an absolute beginning a finite time ago. So people like Vilenkin choose instead to deny the first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And so you find cosmologists like Vilenkin, Stephen Hawking, Lawrence Krauss, saying that the universe came into being uncaused out of nothing. And that's their alternative to belief in the existence of God. And here I would just simply say I think it's far more rational to believe that there's an ultramundane, transcendent cause that brought the universe into being than to think that something can come out of nothing. So on the straightforward, simple level, if you ask why aren't they convinced, you'll look at their objections, why they say they're not convinced, and I don't think those objections are very good. Now, on a deeper level, you might be asking a question about personal psychology. What makes them resistant to this? And here I would say, just think of what's at stake for the atheist. The theist can easily give up the Kalam cosmological argument without giving up his theism. He might have other grounds for believing in theism. In fact, I do. So I can give up the Kalam cosmological argument on the drop of a hat if the evidence should not support it or the arguments should prove to be unsound. But the atheist can't do that, you see. If the argument is sound, then his whole worldview has to change. And I think that some people are so deeply committed to naturalism. Sean Carroll, the cosmologist, comes to mind here, that they will believe almost anything, even that the universe sprang into being and caused out of nothing, rather than embrace theism.
Let's check out the next clip, Bill. I think the Big Bang comes up in this clip. Let's go to this one.
And in this article for the cover issue of Skeptic, so this article he did for us, I want to flesh out the fact that it is by no means settled that there was a Big Bang. Now listen, I said a Big Bang because it seems to me that if there were multiple Big Bangs, that doesn't give more support for a creator than it might give less support for a creator.
Bill?
Well, I think what he's talking about there would be probably inflationary models of the origin of the universe, multiverse models, where the mother universe, so to speak, is this expanding false vacuum. And at different points in this expanding false vacuum, bubbles of true vacuum decay and form mini universes, multiple Big Bangs, as he says, and our universe just happens to be one of these little bubble universes. And that gave some theorists hope of extending this process of inflation not only into the infinite future, but also into the infinite past. And then what happened was that Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin formulated the Board-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which showed that these inflationary models cannot be extended to past infinity, so that even if those models are correct, the universe still began to exist. So in this case, I think it's Brian who hasn't given adequate scrutiny of alternative cosmogonic models.
Here's the next clip, and we start to get into Steve's response here. Let's go to this one.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot to say about that. It's a great question. First of all, there may be confirmation bias in the scientific community that would prevent majority consensus congealing around something as provocative as I'm proposing. We do know that there is a default rule of method known as methodological naturalism that says that if you're going to be a scientist, you have to explain everything by reference to purely materialistic causes, whether you're talking about even including things like the origin of the universe, the origin of life, its fine-tuning, or the origin and nature of human consciousness. And so if that's taken as normative, then no amount of evidence for creative intelligence could move a group of people who already hold that as normative.
Anything to add to Steve's response, Bill?
Well, just this is, I want to say that the scientist in his off hours, so to speak, the scientist as a human being can make the inference to a transcendent creator and designer of the universe, even if when he puts on his white lab coat, as a scientist, he's committed to methodological naturalism. And I fear that some of these fellows, as I said before, are committed not simply to methodological naturalism qua scientist, but they are committed to metaphysical naturalism, that space-time and its material contents is all there is, and that therefore there cannot be a God or a transcendent creator. And so, as Steve quite rightly points out, a commitment to that kind of naturalism will preclude a person's being open to arguments like the Kalam cosmological argument.
Here's more of Steve's response. Let's go to this next clip.
The second thing to say is I don't accept the premise of the question that these evidences and are not moving professionals who are working in the fields in which I'm talking. I've got I got some fantastic book endorsements, including from a Nobel laureate in physics, and from leading scientists, but also going back to the 1980s. You had books like God and the Astronomers by Robert Jastrow. You had the very dramatic public conversion of Alan Sandage, who cited evidences from cosmology as a factor in his intellectual conversion from materialism to theism. And so I don't think we can make an argument one way or another from the sociology of science alone.
Interesting that Steve mentioned Alan Sandage there, the grand old man of astronomy before his death. When we were living in Europe, I had the opportunity to actually meet and chat with Sandage and his longtime collaborator, the Swiss cosmologist Gustav Taman. And it was so exciting to hear Sandage's story of his conversion to Christianity and his belief in God. And I discovered to my surprise that Gustav Taman was also a believer. So two of these giants of astrophysical astronomy were both Christian believers. Also, I had the privilege of meeting Christopher Isham when we were in England. He is probably the greatest quantum cosmologist. And I say that advisedly because that means he's better than Stephen Hawking. And Christopher Isham is likewise a theist. And then George Ellis in the University of South Africa, he's been described by Tony Rothman as the man who knows more about cosmology than any other living human being. And Ellis is also a Christian believer. And when I was in South Africa, I spoke at a cosmology conference on the evidence for the beginning of the universe, and Ellis was my commentator. And he not only reinforced everything that I said for the astronomers that were there, but then added to it by drawing in moral considerations. I thought this is really funny. It's the astrophysicist who's using a moral argument as well to supplement the scientific evidence. So I think Steve's point is good. What we need to keep in mind, however, as has been shown by a sociologist at Rice University, whose name unfortunately I forget, what she shows is that the religious beliefs of scientists today were pretty much formed and set in their early teens before they became scientists, so that their unbelief, insofar as that exists, is not the result of their science. Rather, it was the result of their upbringing and their rejection of perhaps Christianity as these early teenagers. And then that's gotten into cement and stuck with them ever since.
In this next clip, Steve responds to Brian Keating's article. So let's go to the next clip.
As to Brian, he's an interesting guy. He describes himself as an agnostic who wrestles with God, but he clearly is a theist. He's a practicing conservadox Jewish fellow, and he's told me, maybe I don't know what he's told you, but he's told me that he finds the argument from design and biology quite persuasive. So
but not cosmology.
Well, interesting. But let's talk about the cosmology, because what I argue is that the evidence has theistic implications. Obviously, there are new models being proposed all the time, but and I addressed the cyclical and oscillating models in cosmology head on. There's very powerful work critiquing those models going back to Alan Guth, who showed that with each successive cycle in an oscillating universe, you have an accumulation of entropy. You have to, because there's energy blowing the universe apart. And so to get the next cycle has less energy available to do work. You've got an entropy buildup. And therefore, if you'd had an infinite number of cycles, eventually you're going to damp out like a bouncing ball. And if the universe was infinitely old, we would have reached that state of nullifying equilibrium a long time ago. Ergo, the universe couldn't be infinitely old. Ergo, even on an oscillating universe model, you have a beginning. Now, the newer cyclical models have been proposed by Steinhardt and Penrose posit some mechanism with each cycle of reducing entropy, of going back to a highly ordered state. But the mechanisms have no specificity, and they're contrary to everything we know about physics in our universe.
Yes, here Steve responds to some of the alternative models. These oscillating models that he refers to at first were popular among Soviet physicists back in the 1970s, and the thermodynamic problem that he mentions with them was already pointed out by Richard Tolman in the 1930s, and I discussed this in my 1979 book, The Kalam Cosmological Argument. Since then, the models have gotten much more sophisticated. In inflationary models, it's thought that you can avoid this thermodynamic problem, but then along comes the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem that shows that those models cannot be extended to the infinite past. And there are other problems that Vilenkin has pointed out with respect to oscillating universes. And I think Steve is quite right to point out that a model like Roger Penrose's depends upon an alien physics. It is not a physics that governs the actual universe that we know. It's an alien physics that he invents himself in order to have this sort of eternal cyclical cosmology. So I agree with Steve. I think that the evidence is very good for the absolute beginning of the universe at a point in the finite past.
Here's the final clip, Bill. Steve Meyer mentions several issues. Let's go to that right now.
There is a form of naturalism now, which I call in the book exotic naturalism. It's a form of supernatural materialism, where things are posited beyond this universe in order to explain the key features we have about the key indicators we have of a beginning to this universe, as well as the fine-tuning of the universe, as well as the deep mystery of the origin of life. And I think there's a tremendous basis for skepticism about these exotic forms of naturalism, whether we're talking about multiverses in the sense that are invoked to explain the fine tuning, or whether we're talking about an infinite cycle of previous universes to which we have no empirical access by definition, or whether we're talking about Hawking's notion of imaginary time, or even folks positing space alien designers to try to explain the evident evidence for design and the digital informational properties of living systems. I mean, no less a personage than Francis Crick posited panspermia with a design coming from some immanent intelligence within the cosmos, because he recognized the extreme difficulty of explaining the origin of life within this cosmos. Kunin has posited the multiverse as an explanation for the origin of the first life. So I think there's you've made your bread and butter as a skeptic, and rightly so. Many of the things you're skeptical about, I'm skeptical about, but I'm suggesting that there is an appropriate skepticism about these extremely and increasingly convoluted materialistic models that are invoking things beyond this universe, beyond any possible observational confirmation, as explanations for the key features that I'm addressing in the book. So I'm not skeptical about modern cosmology. I think the facts, every indicator we have in cosmology points to a beginning. Of course, we can create imaginative scenarios of multiple cycles before this one, or other verses out there, multiverses, gabillions of them. But I think it's reasonable to be skeptical about them and to weigh whether they really provide a better explanation than the single and more simple postulate in the Occam's razor sense of a transcendent intelligence.
There are a lot of topics in that clip, Bill. Anything jump out at you as we
Yes,
wrap up
yes,
today's
it did,
podcast?
Kevin. I think it's important for our readers to understand that Steve Meyer is a proponent of intelligent design. And one of the earmarks of intelligent design theory is that the inference to a designer is a scientific inference. And therefore, if these exotic multiverse hypotheses don't meet the standards in empirical physical science, Steve is skeptical of them and tends to be dismissive. As a philosopher, I'm frankly much more open to these than Steve is, because for me, the inference to a transcendent creator and designer is a philosophical inference, not a scientific one. I am engaged in what Alexander Vilenkin frankly calls metaphysical cosmology. That's what Vilenkin considers his own work to be. It's metaphysical cosmology. And so I think what we can say is that these multiverse and other sorts of exotic naturalistic theories may not pass muster as scientific theories, but then I don't think that the God hypothesis is a scientific hypothesis either. It's a metaphysical hypothesis. And so we have to consider naturalistic metaphysical hypotheses in addition to considering a theistic metaphysical hypothesis. And my argument is that when you do that, these exotic naturalistic metaphysical hypotheses inevitably fail as good explanations for the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the applicability of mathematics. I think in every case you can show that these multiverse hypotheses are not tenable, and they ultimately fail. So I'm more open than Steve is, I think, to these naturalistic metaphysical hypotheses, because I don't think that the inference to the existence of God needs to be a scientific one, but can be a philosophical or metaphysical one.